In the golden age of Hollywood, few men embodied toughness the way Charles Bronson did. He didn't need flashy dialogue, big smiles, or exaggerated action. One cold stare from him could silence an entire room. Bronson's story wasn't one of glamour. He rose from poverty, working in coal mines before Hollywood ever knew his name. Every scar on his face, every line of his weathered expression, it all told the story of a man who had lived through real struggle. And when he stepped in front of the camera, audiences could feel that raw authenticity. But for a man who became the symbol of grit and masculinity, Bronson had a quiet sense of admiration, a respect for a select few actors who, in his eyes, represented truth, skill, and discipline. These weren't just popular stars. They were craftsmen, men who understood that acting wasn't about fame or fortune, but about conviction. Over the years, Bronson rarely gave interviews, and even less often did he speak about other actors. But when he did, he spoke with honesty and reverence. From his rivals on set to international icons he never met, each name he respected revealed something about who Charles Bronson really was. Behind the tough exterior, behind the gun, behind the legend, today, we dive deep into the 7 actors Charles Bronson respected most, and why they earned a place in the heart of Hollywood's most stoic man. Before Hollywood called him a legend, Charles Bronson was a man who fought his way through every role, every paycheck, and every ounce of recognition he ever earned. But there was one actor whose path constantly crossed his own, Steve McQueen. Their relationship was complicated, fiery, and filled with tension. Yet beneath it all, there was one thing that never wavered: respect. Back in the early 1960s, both Bronson and McQueen were rising stars, men who didn't fit the polished Hollywood mold. They were rough-edged, quiet, and dangerous in their own ways. When they worked together on The Magnificent Seven, 1960, the set became the birthplace of one of Hollywood's most intense rivalries. McQueen, already gaining fame, was charming and unpredictable. Bronson, on the other hand, was reserved and grounded, the kind of man who let his work do the talking. During filming, McQueen reportedly tried to upstage Bronson in several scenes, shifting his hat, reloading his gun, or moving just enough to draw the camera's attention. It was classic McQueen mischief, but Bronson didn't play along. He stood firm, commanding attention through silence. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of authority, no tricks needed. That quiet power is what McQueen came to admire. In later years, friends recalled McQueen admitting that Bronson was one of the few men who could intimidate him without even trying. They were two sides of the same coin. McQueen was the rebel with fire, Bronson, the mountain of steel. Their rivalry deepened when both competed for similar roles in the 60s and 70s. McQueen was the golden boy of Hollywood, the face on every magazine cover, while Bronson had to fight his way up through European cinema before America fully recognized his talent. Yet even in that struggle, Bronson held no bitterness. He saw in McQueen a reflection of himself, a man unwilling to bow to Hollywood's expectations. The tension reached a personal level when McQueen reportedly invited Bronson and his wife Jill Ireland to his home. McQueen was attracted to Ireland's beauty and grace, and though nothing public came of it, the gesture created a quiet but lasting divide between the two men. Still, Bronson never spoke ill of McQueen in interviews. He simply said, "Steve was good. He didn't need to try so hard." After McQueen's passing in 1980, Bronson remained silent. No dramatic statements, no public mourning. But those who knew him said he was deeply affected. McQueen had been more than a rival, and he was a mirror. A man who shared the same stubborn independence, the same refusal to play Hollywood's games. In truth, Charles Bronson respected Steve McQueen because he saw in him the same traits he valued most: toughness, honesty, and a relentless will to be himself. Neither man cared about pleasing the press or chasing awards. They lived by instinct, real men in an industry full of make-believe. Their on-screen chemistry in The Great Escape captured that dynamic perfectly. McQueen played the flashy hero, all charm and motion, while Bronson delivered one of his most human performances, the quiet, Polish tunnel digger who feared tight spaces but never backed down. Behind the scenes, McQueen admired that authenticity. He once told a crew member, Bronson's the only guy here who doesn't have to act tough. He just is. That line, half compliment, half confession, said it all. Beneath the rivalry, Steve McQueen respected Charles Bronson the way soldiers respect each other on the battlefield. They didn't have to like one another to understand each other. And that's why, in the private list of men Charles Bronson admired, Steve McQueen stood right at the top, not as a friend, not as a rival, but as a man who earned his respect the hard way. In Hollywood's long history of rugged men and lone heroes, two names rose above the rest: Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood. They never shared the screen, yet their careers felt like reflections of each other. Both men defined an era when action spoke louder than words, when a stare was deadlier than a speech, and when a man's silence said more than any script ever could. Bronson respected Eastwood not because of fame, fortune, or awards, but because Clint Eastwood carved his own path with a kind of quiet power that few dared to follow. In the late 1960s, when Hollywood was shifting toward flashier leading men, Eastwood went to Italy, starring in Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. Ironically, it was the same Italian Western movement that made Bronson a legend through Once Upon a Time in the West. Both men, on opposite sides of the camera lens, were redefining masculinity: lean, quiet, dangerous, and utterly believable. Bronson admired that Eastwood didn't chase the studio system. He built his own. He didn't wait for roles. He created them. From acting to directing, Eastwood became the master of his craft, not for the glamour, but for control over his own destiny. Bronson once said in an interview, "I don't work for the money. I work so I don't have to take orders." It was the same philosophy that guided Clint Eastwood's career from the beginning. Both men shared that rare gift, command through stillness. They could stand in complete silence, and yet their presence filled the frame. Directors loved working with both because they didn't need big dialogue to create emotion. Eastwood's slow squint and Bronson's hard gaze carried an entire film's tension. In the 1970s, when Eastwood was making Dirty Harry and Bronson was ruling Europe with The Mechanic and Death Wish, the two men represented a fading archetype, heroes who lived by a personal code. They weren't talkers or charmers. They were doers, and audiences across the world could feel that authenticity. Privately, Eastwood was known to speak with respect about Bronson's work. In one old interview, Clint called Bronson a man who doesn't act tough. He just understands what it means. Coming from Eastwood, that was no small compliment. For Bronson, that respect was mutual. He saw in Clint a man who had stayed true to himself despite Hollywood's temptations. He admired that Eastwood refused to become a cliché. Instead, he grew deeper with time, evolving from action star to respected filmmaker. When Eastwood directed Unforgiven in 1992, Bronson reportedly praised it as a film made by a man who understands violence and guilt. Both men also shared a personal philosophy about fame. Neither enjoyed interviews, and both disliked Hollywood's artificial lifestyle. They preferred solitude, horses, open skies, and silence. Bronson spent most of his later life on his Vermont estate, far from Los Angeles, while Eastwood found peace in Carmel, California, directing films on his own terms. Perhaps that's why Bronson held Eastwood in such high regard, because he represented something pure. A man who didn't sell out, who didn't pretend, who didn't need to shout to be heard. To Bronson, Clint Eastwood was more than a movie star. He was proof that discipline and simplicity could outlast the noise of fame. Two men who never needed each other's approval somehow found it anyway. They both spoke the same language, the unspoken one. The kind that only true professionals understand. In another time, in another world, maybe they would have shared a screen, not as rivals, but as equals. But perhaps the mystery is what made the respect even greater. Because for Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood was the rare man who didn't just play strong, he lived it. And in Bronson's quiet world of earned respect, that was everything. If Charles Bronson respected one thing above all else, it was authenticity. Men who had lived hard lives and carried their experience like a badge. And no one embodied that more than Lee Marvin. Marvin wasn't just another Hollywood tough guy. He had lived the part. A former Marine who fought in World War II, He had been wounded in battle, his back scarred by shrapnel, his walk forever marked by the war he survived. When he returned to America, Marvin didn't chase fame. He simply brought his real-life grit to the screen. When Bronson met Marvin on the set of The Dirty Dozen in 1967, he instantly recognized a kindred spirit. There were no egos, no pretense, no Hollywood games between them, just mutual understanding. Both men had come from working-class backgrounds. Both had faced real hardship, and both believed that toughness didn't need to be performed. It needed to be lived. During the filming of The Dirty Dozen, Marvin commanded the set like a true leader, not through arrogance but through presence. He was the sergeant everyone respected. Bronson, who played one of the rebellious soldiers, admired Marvin's natural authority. He didn't need to shout or overact. His voice carried weight because it came from experience. Behind the scenes, Marvin and Bronson shared long conversations about life outside of Hollywood. Crew members later recalled that Bronson rarely spoke, but when he did, it was usually with Marvin. They talked about the absurdity of fame, the value of discipline, and the loneliness that came with being men who were too real for an industry built on illusion. In interviews, Marvin once said, "You can always tell who's pretending. Bronson doesn't pretend. He's got that same look soldiers get after the war, like they've seen too much and can't be fooled anymore." That line summed up the mutual respect between the two. They were both warriors, not actors trying to look like them. While most of Hollywood admired Marvin's charisma and wit, Bronson admired something deeper, his honesty. Marvin drank too much, joked too much, and refused to play politics. He was as flawed as any man, and Bronson liked that. To him, Marvin represented truth, the kind of man who didn't hide behind charm or fame. Their friendship continued beyond The Dirty Dozen. Marvin became one of the few actors Bronson openly spoke well of. In a rare interview during the 1970s, when asked about the people he respected most in the business, Bronson simply replied, "Lee Marvin. He's a soldier. He knows what's real." That word, soldier, carried meaning for Bronson. Though he never served in the military, he had grown up in a family of 15 children in Pennsylvania, working in coal mines from a young age. He knew struggle, he knew exhaustion, and he knew how to survive. To him, Lee Marvin's battle scars weren't just physical. They were symbols of endurance. Both men carried themselves with the same quiet dignity. They didn't chase celebrity parties or publicity stunts. They preferred work over words. And though their careers took different paths, Marvin diving into gritty dramas like Point Blank, and Bronson ruling the vigilante genre with Death Wish, they both stood for a kind of masculinity that no longer exists in modern cinema. When Lee Marvin passed away in 1987, Bronson didn't attend the public memorial. He was a deeply private man, uncomfortable with ceremonies and crowds. But close friends said Bronson spent that evening alone at his ranch, watching The Dirty Dozen, his silent tribute to a man he called a real one. Lee Marvin was not just an actor Bronson respected. He was a symbol, a reminder of when men on screen had lived through the same battles they portrayed. For Charles Bronson, respect was never given to the loudest voice or the biggest star. It belonged to the men who lived their truth, and in that regard, Lee Marvin was one of the few who stood shoulder to shoulder with him, not just as a performer, but as a man. When people talk about the greatest Western ever made, one title is always mentioned: Once Upon a Time in the West. But behind the breathtaking cinematography and haunting music, it was the quiet intensity between two actors, Charles Bronson and Henry Fonda, that gave the film its soul. By the time the movie was filmed in 1968, Henry Fonda was already Hollywood royalty, the beloved face of justice and integrity from films like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. Charles Bronson, on the other hand, was still climbing. He was respected in Europe, but America hadn't fully embraced him yet. Working alongside Fonda, the man he'd admired from afar, was both intimidating and inspiring. When director Sergio Leone cast Fonda as the villain, a cold-blooded killer named Frank, it shocked everyone. Fonda had always been the moral compass of American cinema, but Bronson saw something brilliant in that choice. To him, Fonda's transformation represented the highest form of acting, the courage to destroy your image in service of truth. During the shoot, Bronson kept his distance at first. He wasn't one for socializing, and Fonda, much older and deeply professional, wasn't either. Yet, a mutual respect grew between them, a wordless bond between two men who believed in the power of restraint. Crew members recalled moments on set when Fonda would give subtle advice, not in lectures, but in glances and gestures. He showed Bronson how stillness could speak louder than dialogue, how silence could command more attention than shouting. Leone once said, "Bronson learned from Fonda that the less you do, the more the audience watches you." And it was true. In Once Upon a Time in the West, Bronson's character, Harmonica, barely speaks. Yet every wordless scene vibrates with emotion. Much of that performance came from what he absorbed by simply watching Fonda work. Fonda, in turn, admired Bronson's grounded nature. He saw in him a rare purity, an actor unspoiled by ego or vanity. Fonda once remarked in an interview, "Bronson doesn't seem to care about the camera. That's why it loves him." That mutual recognition, one from Hollywood's old guard, the other from its new outsider, meant a great deal to Bronson. He had never been the type to seek approval, but he valued respect when it came from someone who had earned his. Off camera, their interactions were quiet but genuine. During breaks, they'd share cigarettes in silence, occasionally discussing the absurdity of Hollywood fame. Fonda was reflective, almost philosophical, while Bronson remained concise, a man of few words. But those brief exchanges left a lasting mark. After filming ended, Leone called both men opposite poles of the same power. Fonda, the elegant storm; Bronson, the unshakable mountain. Together they represented two generations of masculinity, one fading, one rising. Bronson would later tell a journalist, "Henry taught me that still waters run deep. You don't have to move to show strength." It was more than just admiration. It was mentorship, even if neither ever said it aloud. When Fonda passed away in 1982, Bronson was filming overseas. He didn't make a public statement, as was his nature. But his wife, Jill Ireland, later revealed that Bronson spent the evening quietly revisiting scenes from Once Upon a Time in the West. He said very little, except one simple line. "He was the kind of man I wish Hollywood made more of." For Charles Bronson, Henry Fonda wasn't just another name on his list of respected actors. He was proof that power didn't need to shout. In an industry obsessed with noise, Fonda embodied what Bronson believed in most: truth, simplicity, and discipline. It wasn't about fame or awards or headlines. It was about standing still and letting the audience come to you. And in that lesson, Henry Fonda became one of the few men who truly earned Charles Bronson's deepest respect.